Hello, everyone, and welcome to Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. I'm Ben Watkins, your host, and I've got something of a special treat for everyone today because this is going to be my first quote-unquote response video. So a friend of mine, Lewis Rowe of God's Rocker, decided to make a video response to some of the posts that I had put up on Facebook criticizing what's known as the moral argument. So for those who might not be familiar, the moral argument is defended by apologists like William Lane Craig and Frank Turek. And the basic structure of the argument is that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But the second premise is, but objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, the conclusion is 3, that God exists. So I gave about 5 arguments against this sort of view that the moral argument kind of often implies. It's what's called modified divine command theory. And that's the view that moral truths, subjective moral truths, are somehow dependent on God's existence. So, in other words, atheism implies moral nihilism. Well, I don't think there's any good reason to concede this premise to an apologist. So I put forward 5 objections. The first I called the argument from intrinsic value. The second I called the argument from moral autonomy. The third I called the argument from the robust objectivity of morality. And the fourth was the argument from psychopathy, and then the last was the argument from necessary moral truths. So I'll go through each of Lewis's responses to these arguments, as well as unpacking those arguments a little bit further myself. For those interested in God's Rocker's video responding to these arguments, I'll include that link in the description so that you might want to watch that first before watching this video, but if not, I'll try to include as much detail as I can in this video so that you can watch this one just kind of on its own. Also, I want to give, since this is my first response video and first time kind of working out this recording software, I wanted to give 2 additional arguments against modified divine command theory. These 2 additional arguments are ones that I've been playing around with of recent, and I might combine them somehow. I'm not convinced yet that they deserve to be 2 distinct arguments, or maybe they can kind of be combined into one of the arguments I've already given. I don't know yet. I'm still thinking on them. But first, I want to go ahead and get into some of the objections that Lewis Rowe raised to my objections to modified divine command theory and the moral argument. So my first argument was the argument from intrinsic value. And so this, I think, is one of my stronger arguments because I think that it counters the apologists' intuition. They're trying to appeal to, an authority, to behind a law. Laws have lawgivers. They're trying to appeal to that intuitive intuition, so to speak. The reason I like this argument so much is because I think it uses a competing intuition, the one that there are things of intrinsic value other than just God. And so it acts almost as a reductio of Lewis's view, because basically it says, look, if there are things that have intrinsic value other than God, well, then your view is false, because the modified divine command theory, or at least Lewis's formulation of it, implies that God is the only thing of intrinsic value. So let's get into what Lewis had to say. So Lewis concedes my premise A here, that if things could only have value in virtue of God existing, then the only thing of intrinsic value is God. However, Lewis suggests my use of the term intrinsic value might be ambiguous. I am making use of a familiar distinction between two kinds of value, intrinsic value and extrinsic value. So this distinction might not be clear, and I certainly didn't lay it out in the presentation of that argument when I originally posted it. So let me take that time now to kind of unpack this distinction a little bit. So by intrinsic value, I mean the value something has in virtue of its own nature in and of itself. We all have reason to want something of intrinsic value for its own sake and not merely for the sake of something else. So notice that I said that we all have reason. So I'm using the word reason here in its irreducibly normative sense. So the concept of a reason is any consideration which counts in favor of having a belief or performing some sort of action. So I want to say this at the outset because this irreducibly normative concept of a reason is, or a consideration that counts in favor, is very important throughout much of my ethical reasoning while faced with a moral argument or someone defending a form of modified divine command theory. So by extrinsic value, so I laid out intrinsic value just a second ago, and now I'm moving to extrinsic value. When I say extrinsic value, I mean the value a thing has in virtue of how it is related to other things. We all have reason to want something of extrinsic value for the sake of something else. That something else may also be of extrinsic value or intrinsic value. Something of extrinsic value is only relevantly good or worth achieving if it is valued for the sake of something else that is eventually intrinsically valuable. So Lewis claimed, I would say things have value depending on how similar they are to God. And so I'm going to agree with Lewis here. This claim is consistent with Lewis's concession of A. On his view, God would be the only thing of intrinsic value. He would be valuable in virtue of his own nature in and of itself. Everything else would be merely extrinsically valuable or valuable in virtue of how it was related to God. In this case, everything not God would have mere extrinsic value depending on how similar it was to God's nature. And that's more or less how I understand Lewis's view. So Lewis instead challenges my premise B. He claims that I've equated the terms good and the term pleasurable. But that is not so. For starters, I defend a form of ethical non-naturalism. I believe that normative properties like goodness and badness can't be reduced or identified with non-normative natural properties like pleasure or pain. I do believe that pleasure is intrinsically good and that pain is intrinsically bad, but I also believe that these properties are part of the natures of pleasure and pain. They're not identical with it. Additionally, I believe that pleasure and pain can be instrumentally good or bad. In other words, pain, though intrinsically bad as it is, can also be instrumentally good. In other words, pain can be a vehicle to some other higher ordered intrinsic good. Thus, such pain would be extrinsically good because it would be related to something else of intrinsic value. We can see this distinction at work with Lewis's paradigmatic dentist example. So in his video, he imagines a dentist working on our teeth, and any pain that the dentist causes is intrinsically bad or in itself bad, but it's also instrumentally or extrinsically good because it serves as a vehicle for or is related to the intrinsic good of having healthy teeth or avoiding the future pain associated having unhealthy teeth. Obviously here I'm assuming that, good health is an intrinsic value and that the avoidance of pain that would, be associated with unhealthy teeth, that's also an intrinsic good. When the dentist causes us pain, she is not doing something wrong so long as the cause pain is instrumentally necessary to bring about some other intrinsic good. But now let's imagine that a dentist could have given us anesthetics to prevent any pain, but instead just wantonly or carelessly chooses not to give us those anesthetics. In this case, she has done something wrong, or at least objectionable, because the pain she is causing is not of any instrumental value. We are left with the intrinsic badness of the pain, which the dentist could have easily prevented. So Lewis in his video objects. He goes, you can't make the blanket statement that pleasure or happiness is intrinsically good and suffering or pain is intrinsically bad. But as we've just seen, that's not so. As I've just shown, we can make those exact blanket statements. In fact, those claims are what motivate historical and contemporary normative theories of hedonistic utilitarianism or consequentialism. According to such theories, we all have most reason to maximize pleasure or happiness for its own sake, and we have most reason to minimize pain or suffering for its own sake. Though I do not believe hedonism is the whole truth, I do believe that it's at least part of the truth, because I believe pleasure and pain are intrinsically valuable. These intrinsic values are what Lewis must deny in order to avoid my conclusion in C. So Lewis could argue, if values like good and bad do not depend on God, then there must be something other than God that we have reason to want for its own sake. 2, nothing other than God could give us all reason to want it for its own sake. Therefore, 3, values like good and bad do depend on God. If we accept the conclusion in 3, then we could validly infer 4, pleasure and happiness are not intrinsically good, and 5, pain and suffering are not intrinsically bad. But if you're like me, then you probably find these implications hard to believe. We could similarly argue against these implausible implications as follows. We do have reason to want pleasure and happiness for their own sake. 2 star, we do have reason to want to avoid pain and suffering for its own sake. Therefore, 3 star, some things other than God are of intrinsic value. Given the conclusion in 3 star, we can validly infer things like 4 star, values like good and bad do not depend on God. So these two arguments that I've given are symmetric because each argument takes as premises the denial of the other argument's conclusions. The better argument is the one whose premises are more plausible, since both arguments are logically valid and support their conclusions equally well. Now, which seems more plausible? Lewis's 2, nothing other than God could give us all reason to want it for its own sake, or my 1 star and 2 star, which say, we all do have reason to want pleasure and happiness for its own sake, and we all do have reason to want to avoid pain and suffering for its own sake. Now, my 1 star and 2 star strike me as obviously more plausible than Lewis's 2. And I doubt my judgment on this would be idiosyncratic. Thus, it would seem unreasonable for someone to reject the latter propositions on the basis of the former without some really convincing argument. So, are there any good arguments for the claim that atheism implies that nothing is of intrinsic value? Well, I argue that there are not. To be sure, I claimed in my original post that most, if not all, apologists give little to no justification for their claim that atheism somehow implies moral nihilism or some form of moral subjectivism. This claim was met with incredulity from Lewis. He asks, how is it that you could possibly be unaware that there are reasons to say that without God, there can be no intrinsic values? He even goes as far as to say, Speedy believes that objective moral values can be found without God, and that there alone, to me, is a massive contradiction in his worldview. But what argument does Lewis give for this quote-unquote massive contradiction in my worldview? Why ought we believe that atheism implies there is nothing of intrinsic value? What really good argument does Lewis have that has premises which are more plausible than my 1 star and 2 star, as they were before? We all do have reason to want pleasure and happiness for its own sake, and we all do have reason to want to avoid pain and suffering for its own sake. Well, Lewis argues like this. He says atheists claim while we have our short lives, we should make the best of them while we can. But the big question of why looms over them. There's no answer except I like pleasure and I'd prefer to experience as little pain as possible. I'm saying that the goal of atheism is purely subjective, and that means moral nihilism is the only logical conclusion. The facts of reality dictate that atheists should realize that by being morally good people, they are living a lie, because their worldview, there's just no room for intrinsic values. What could ever be intrinsically good about you, about what you do in a universe that big, when the speck of dust that is the human race disappears? So, by all means, try to make your life and the lives of others around you better. Try and improve the human condition as best you can. I'm all for that. Just don't pretend there's any reason outside of human self interest for doing it. But Lewis here is merely asserting that if atheism is true, then we can only have mere subjective preferences, and that we would have no non self interested reasons to prefer the happiness of others to the suffering of others. But that is not so. We can clearly see this by drawing another distinction between self interested reasons and impartial reasons. What we have most self interested reason to want is whatever would make things go best for us from our particular point of view. But what we have most impartial reason to prefer is whatever would make things go impartially best, in the sense that this is the outcome that, from an impartial point of view, everyone would have most reason to want to come about. For example, we all have impartial reasons to care about the well-being of others regardless of their relation to us, because that is what everyone would have most reason to want from an impartial point of view. This impartial point of view is what Thomas Nagel has called the view from nowhere, and what Henry Sidgwick and Peter Singer have called the point of view of the universe. It's the point of view we can take when we conceive of ourselves as our place in the world and our relations to others. These impartial reasons are person neutral or agent neutral, in the sense that these are reasons provided by facts whose description need not refer to our particular point of view. By contrast, self-interested reasons are person relative or agent relative, in the sense that these reasons are provided by facts whose description does refer to our particular point of view. Lewis merely asserts that on atheism, we could only ever have self-interested reasons, and we are merely pretending to have impartial reasons to want things to go impersonally best. I simply reject his assertion here. Lewis has given us no argument for it whatsoever. Well, I guess that's not entirely true. We're supposed to draw the conclusion that human happiness and suffering are not intrinsically valuable, and that we do not have impartial reasons to care about these things for their own sake from Lewis's premises. Humans, even if happy, are very small compared to the universe. Humans, even if happy, die after a short time. And eventually all humans, even if happy, while alive, will eventually be permanently dead. These are the sorts of facts that Lewis claimed dictate that atheists should realize in their worldview there is no room for intrinsic values. But I fail to see why anyone should move from these premises to the conclusion that happiness and suffering are not of intrinsic value, or that we cannot have impartial reasons to care about these things for their own sake. These premises do not even support that conclusion. This is simply a non sequitur on Lewis's part. In fact, I would make the stronger claim that the strongest objection to Lewis's mere assertion that nothing other than God can have intrinsic value can take the form of a question. Why can't the natures of happiness or suffering give everyone impartial reasons or agent-neutral reasons to want, for its own sake, ourselves and others to be happy rather than to suffer? Why is something else needed for us to have these sorts of reasons, or for these sorts of things to matter for their own sake? I will claim no apologist has a good response to this question, including Lewis. If that's the case, then we have undefeated reasons to believe that some things other than God are intrinsically valuable. We do all have impartial reasons to want happiness for ourselves and for others for its own sake. Therefore, some things can have value even if God does not exist. And it would follow from this, if this argument is sound, that therefore Lewis's view is false. So that's by far the most substantive argument, and certainly the one that Lewis spends the most time addressing. So the rest of the arguments won't be nearly as involved as this one, but I think this is probably one of the more important arguments, because I think that it becomes very obvious to see that Lewis's view is a reductionist view, and what he's trying to reduce morality to just isn't rich enough to account for all the things that we see as more or experience as morally relevant in the world. It's just like naturalistic reductionist projects. I don't think that this supernatural, theologically based reductionist project succeeds either. So let's move on to my next argument, which was the argument from the autonomy of ethics. This one I also think is a very important argument, and it can be difficult to understand because the concept of autonomy is one that's seen throughout the history of philosophy through philosophers like Plato to Aquinas to Kant, and even into modern day ethicists like Scanlon and Parfit and Nagel. So that argument goes like this. My premise D is if morality is externally imposed on human persons by God, then morality is not autonomous or self-governing. And then my premise E is, but morality is autonomous. Morality requires us to give ourselves moral principles which we could all rationally will. And so, therefore, it would follow F, morality is not externally imposed on human persons by God. Well, if this argument is sound and Lewis's view implies that morality is externally imposed on human persons by God, then it obviously follows that Lewis's view is false. But before I get into all of that, I want to get a little bit more clear about the concepts in play here. So let's start with my premise D. Ooh, excuse me. What do I mean by moral autonomy? To be a moral agent is to be autonomous or self-governed or self-directed. Unlike legal laws imposed on us by society, codes of honor, and rules of etiquette, moral principles or moral rules are imposed by the agent upon herself. Thus, the moral person is one who acts according to principles that she can, on reflection, conscientiously and rationally will herself. If God or any other external sources impose moral principles or rules on us, the morality would not be autonomous because someone else would have an unqualified claim on our obedience. Such an unqualified claim on our obedience is simply incompatible with being a moral agent. It is to opt out of moral thinking altogether and abandon one's role as a moral thinker. It's easiest to see how crucial autonomy is to normative ethics when we look at non-moral autonomy like rationality. So, for example, let's say that I have a choice to accept either claim X or claim Y. Then let's say that Lewis commands me to accept X instead of Y. So I freely choose to accept claim X merely because Lewis commanded me so. Will we say that I've acted rationally? No. We should ask, what did I have most reason to believe? Did Lewis even have good reason to command me to accept claim A? Well, that wasn't even considered in the thought experiment. If I examined the evidence and then believed what the evidence gave me sufficient reason to accept, which was X instead of Y, then and only then have I acted rationally. What I believe and how I think was governed or self-directed and was not externally imposed on me like the command from Lewis was. I found the source of my rationality within my own sense of reason. Thomas Nagel helps us see this point clearly when he famously claimed, reason can serve as a court of appeal not only against the received opinions and habits of our community or our divine commander, but also against the peculiarities of our personal perspective. It is something each individual can find within himself, but at the same time it has universal authority, even for a divine commander. Whoever appeals to reason purports to discover a source of authority within himself that is not merely personal or societal, but universal, and that should also persuade others who are willing to listen to it. I believe these claims apply not only to rationality, but also to morality. What we have is a conflict between Lewis's view, which implies an unqualified and total subservience to the demands of a divine commander, and the role of moral agent, which necessarily involves autonomous decision-making. When we are deciding how to act, we appeal to considerations internal to ourselves and given to ourselves like practical reasons for action, rather than to external considerations that are being imposed on us like demands from a divine commander. But Lewis misses a lot of this. He instead interprets me as meaning, I'm taking Speeding's meaning to be that God programs us with moral principles that we follow without thinking about them ourselves. Given my remarks so far about autonomous decision-making being a necessary condition of moral agency, it should be obvious that this is not what I mean. I'm not claiming that God is programming anything into us. I'm claiming that on Lewis's divine command view, God is imposing the moral principles that I ought to act on, much in the same way Lewis was imposing on me what I ought to believe in my previous example about rationality. In both scenarios, I could freely choose not to listen to God or to not listen to Lewis. Lewis almost gets it right by trying to understand my meaning as God being an externally imposing lawgiver of morality. When we look at something relating to rationality, like the laws of logic, we can clearly see that these laws or principles do not require a lawgiver. Why? Because rationality is an autonomous decision-making process. We ought not to contradict ourselves, regardless of what someone has told us to do or what we may want to do. Similarly, moral laws do not require a lawgiver. Why? Because morality is an autonomous decision-making process. We ought to act on principles everyone could rationally will, regardless of what someone has commanded us to do or what we may want to do otherwise. But if morality is an autonomous decision-making process, and Lewis's divine command view implies that morality is not autonomous in this way, then Lewis's divine command view is false. So now I want to look at my next argument, which is the argument from the robust objectivity of morality. So, I think I've messed up some slides here. Let me figure out why. So I have somehow lost the slide which gives the argument from robust objectivity of morality. So I guess I'll just have to read that off separately. I apologize about that. So the argument from the robust objectivity of morality. So this argument might be a little surprising to some people because they think, well, hey, isn't the whole point of adopting a moral argument or a modified form of divine command theory is so that we get the objectivity of morality? Well, it's yes and no. We get it in a superficial sense in that God is a separate agent from ourselves. So it's objective in that sense, but it's not objective in the sense that it doesn't depend on any subject at all. So that would be a much more robust form of objectivity. And so I argue that morality is more objective in a robust sense than in a subject given sense, where that subject is just merely is non-human, is something separate from humans. I think that the modified form of divine command theory is just a well-disguised form of subjectivism that has in it a way of trying to account for the objectivity that we instinctively feel when it comes to our moral thinking. So my premise G was, if moral truths depend on God, then moral truths depend on the attitudes or responses of a subject. My premise H was, but moral truths do not depend on the attitudes or responses of any subject, i.e. they're discovered by subjects and not invented by any subject. Therefore, my conclusion I was moral truths do not depend on God. Now, when Lewis responded to this argument, I just don't even think he was in the right ballpark. He sees this argument as a reformulation of the Euthyphro dilemma, But that is not so. I will concede that the Euthyphro dialogue could help us understand why moral reasons are independent of facts about subjects rather than dependent on facts about subjects, but the Euthyphro dilemma itself is not needed to make the case that moral truths do not depend on facts about subjects. To avoid any further confusion of this kind, it would probably be helpful to make clear what I mean by the robust objectivity of morality and what I mean in my claim G, that Lewis's view implies that moral truths depend on the attitudes or responses of a subject. So let's put the Euthyphro dilemma to the side and we won't even return to it. So that objection just won't even be relevant. To be clear, I'm not putting forward a metaphysical theory about the contents of the universe, such as objects in the universe or outside of the universe in some Platonic realm. An objectivist or realist view of morality contrasted with a subjectivist or anti-realist view of morality is about the order of normative explanation. If morality is subjective, then what we morally ought to do is whatever would best fulfill the desires or aims of a subject, what some subject would choose to do in some circumstance, or what some subject would command others to do in some circumstance. Since these are all facts about subjects, we can call such moral reasons subject-given. This is what I meant when I claim that subjectivism implies that moral truths depend on the attitudes or responses of subjects. Moral truths on the subjectivist view are being explained by further facts about subjects, which are themselves non-normative facts. By contrast, if objectivism about morality is true, then this order of normative explanation is reversed. We ought morally to act in some way whenever what we are doing or trying to achieve is in itself good or right. Since these are facts about the objects of desires or acts that are independent of subjects, we can call such moral reasons object-given. In other words, objectivists believe that it is the facts intrinsic to our character traits and acts which give subjects moral reason. Subjectivists, on the other hand, believe it is facts about characters or subjects who perform acts which give us moral reasons. Here's Christine Korsgaard making this exact same point. Subjectivism implies that things are good or right because of the interest subjects have in them. Objectivism reverses this relation. Instead of saying that what subjects are interested in is therefore good or right, the objectivist says that the goodness or rightness is in the object, and subjects ought therefore to be interested in it. Lewis's view clearly falls into the subjectivist camp, because his view implies that moral truths depend on the nature and commands of a subject, namely God. All of our moral reasons would be subject-given. Lewis gives us away when he objects, moral truths need some kind of foundation. The Christian concept of God is that he is the ultimate good embodied, and if you actually think about what goodness might be if it was some kind of object, you'll probably have to conclude that it would be a personal being who could make moral choices and give love and so on, which is another reason why I think it's some kind of Platonic object that is goodness doesn't make sense. The foundation that Lewis is searching for and failing to find on atheism are facts about subjects other than human subjects. It's not surprising that Lewis would fail to find such subject-given moral reasons that were not human subjects on atheism, assuming we would, alien subjects, we'll put alien subjects to one side. But if objectivism about morality is true, then there is no such subject-given foundation, because the space of reasons is not reducible to anything non-normative like facts about subjects. It seems Lewis is stuck in a subjectivist framework. So in reality, Lewis's view does not offer us any more objectivity than other competing subjectivist views like ethical constructivism or ideal observer theory. For example, Lewis says, atheist subjectivity is based on human well-being and theist subjectivity based on the will of God. Given these remarks, I will argue that Lewis does not have the correct concept of objectivity when it comes to ethics as a whole and morality in particular. On objectivism, moral truths do not need any further subject-given foundation or ground outside of themselves. In this sense, moral truths are, to use the philosophical jargon, sui generis, or of its own kind. The same is true of non-moral normative truths about what we have most reason to believe. For example, if we knew that some argument was valid and it had true premises, then those facts would give us decisive reason to accept this argument's conclusion in the sense that we rationally should or ought to accept it. And if we didn't, then we would be making a mistake. We would be getting something wrong. This objective normative truth is not made true by facts of any other non-normative kind, including the commands of any subject. It is nothing but itself. It is irreducibly normative. Similarly, if I will run over a dog, if I don't step on my brakes, then those are the facts which give me moral reason to step on my brakes. The more general moral truth that we should not cause unnecessary harm to another sentient creature is not made true by facts of any other kind, including the commands of any subject. It is nothing but itself. It is irreducibly normative. We can also add that these normative truths do not have any ontologically weighty implications. In this respect, normative truths resemble mathematical, logical, and modal truths. They are simply true in their own right. We don't need to invoke any Platonic objects into our ontology in order to have these truths either. Just like mathematicians should not worry that all their theories are false because there are no Platonic number objects, ethicists should not worry that all of their normative theories are false because there are no Platonic normative objects. This additional meta-philosophical claim is a view often called quietism. Lewis really misses the mark when he objects. I skipped a slide again. My bad, guys. That's what sui generis means. So Lewis objected, what we have is a goal to improve human life. And one team has human minds and one team has God's mind. Now, will you pick the team that has fallible or limited minds, or the team that has a loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful mind? Of the two, I think it's obvious which one is going to spell out the better moral code. Moral truths don't depend on God, but so what? We're still better off trusting rather than anyone else. Putting aside the fact that Lewis says here, a better moral code, I wonder what standard he's appealing to other than God to say that a code that God created was better than another. Anyways, we'll put that aside. There's a much bigger mistake here because Lewis has clearly confused moral ontology with moral epistemology. He's also, I believe, erroneously assuming that morality is something invented or subject-given rather than something discovered or object-given, but I've already laid out that objection. He is objecting that humans have fallible minds when trying to figure out which acts are good or bad, right or wrong. And by contrast, God is omniscient and would know all truths about what matters, and he could supply us with those moral truths, or would be in the ideal position to invent or construct a system of morality for us. I can concede all of this, but that does not make one iota of difference to my argument from the robust objectivity of morality. My argument is about what morality is, or ontology, and not about how we know moral truths or epistemology. If God does exist, knows all truths about what matters, and he could reliably communicate these truths to us, then I have no issue conceding that God would be the best person to seek moral advice from. In this sense, God would be the ultimate moral authority, even though, as I believe, moral truths do not depend on his existence. He would be like the wise sage on top of the mountain who knew all truths about what mattered, that were independent of himself. We go up to him as a moral authority, ask him what we should or ought do, and we would take his advice because we would have good reason to do that because he would know all those truths. So I can concede all that. I'm saying that morality can't be reduced to this picture in an ontological sense. We can't take all of our moral truths and say that what makes these claims true are facts about this divine subject. So there is no real challenge from Lewis to my argument from the robust objectivity of morality. But if morality is robustly objective, and Lewis's divine command view implies that morality is not robustly objective, then it follows that Lewis's divine command view is false. Whew. All right, guys, we're getting through there. My next argument is the argument from psychopathy, which I was heavily inspired by the William Lane Craig and Eric Wielenberg debate. I actually got to have a conversation with Eric Wielenberg after that debate, and we discussed this argument in quite some length. So this was how those thoughts have developed since that conversation. So the argument starts with premise J, and it says, if morality depends on God, then psychopaths should not exist because all of God's creatures would have the moral law written on their hearts, and they would understand the authority of morality. And then my premise K is, but psychopaths do exist, and they do not understand the authority of morality. Therefore, my conclusion L, morality does not depend on God. As I said before, this argument was taken from Eric Wielenberg's debate with Dr. Craig. And actually, I'm going to include a link to that debate in the description as well. I think if you haven't seen that debate, it's a very good debate to go check out. And Dr. Eric Wielenberg defends the same metaethical views that I would, maybe with some minor tweaking, or, as all philosophers don't necessarily agree on everything. So Lewis objects to this argument by saying this argument seems to hark back to the early one that suggests that when God gives laws, he programs them into us in a way we can't avoid. But as I said before, I'm not claiming that God would, quote, program us in any way. All of my claims in this argument are compatible with human freedom of choice, even in an incompatibilist or libertarian sense. I don't make any determinations about what view of free will is true. But according to Lewis's view, person X has a moral obligation to Y if and only if God has issued person X a divine command to Y. If God does not command person X to Y, then person X has no moral obligation to Y. We are often told that God imposes such obligations on people by writing the demands of God's moral law on their hearts of all people. So they have an intuitive grasp of the content of God's commands and the authority behind them. So I agree with Lewis when he says, I missed another slide. You guys, this is my first video. I realize I kind of suck at this, so hopefully they will get better as time goes on. Here we go. The law written on our hearts is understood by some to mean our conscience, and our conscience tells us right from wrong. Woo! Sorry, guys. My speaking voice is disappearing on me. But anyways, the existence of psychopaths refutes this claim, because it appears that psychopaths do not have a conscience that tells them right from wrong. Psychopaths lack the constraints of a conscience, as if God has not written a moral law on their heart. Additionally, psychopaths are incapable of things like love and empathy, and so are unable to grasp the authority of what morality demands of us. They understand moral rules as merely annoying obstacles to either manipulate or to just outright ignore. Moral reasons or moral rules have no normative force for psychopaths. Since psychopaths seem unable to grasp the authority of moral demands, it does not seem that God has given these people any divine commands. But Lewis's view implies that these people have no moral obligations and therefore cannot do anything morally wrong. But I think this is simply an unacceptable implication of Lewis's divine command theory. His view implies that psychopaths just should not exist, because if they did, then they could never perform any wrong actions because they didn't have any moral obligations, because they didn't know that they had any commands from God. But since psychopaths do exist, then it follows that Lewis's view is false. And so this brings me to my last argument, which was the argument from necessary moral truths. So this argument makes use quite liberally of modal semantics. So these are claims about what is necessary and contingent, or what is possible. So if you're a modal skeptic, then this argument probably isn't going to have any force. But if you're like me and you think that there's nothing wrong with using modal semantics and that there are truths in this domain, then I think this argument is quite decisive. So the argument was premise M: if morality depends on God, then God must exist in every possible world because basic moral truths are necessary moral truths, i.e., they're true in all possible worlds. Premise N: but God does not exist in every possible world because atheism is true in some possible world. Therefore, O: morality does not depend on God. Lewis begins by conceding M. He agrees with me that basic moral truths are necessary truths. If it is true that wanton cruelty is wrong, then it must be true in every possible world. There is no possible world which is identical to ours in all of its non-moral respects, but in which the Holocaust was morally permissible. Even though Lewis concedes M, I'm not so sure Lewis understands this modal claim because he objects by saying, atheism can't give us moral truths, let alone necessary ones. But what could this possibly mean? If moral truths are necessary truths, then they could not fail to be true. Atheism wouldn't need to give us anything. Basic moral truths would just be true in all possible worlds, which would include possible worlds where God does not exist. But it gets even stranger when Lewis objects to my premise N by saying, atheism is true in some possible worlds seems like a bold statement to make, especially without a lick of evidence. Sounds like scientism gone mad. But why would it seem like a bold statement, or even scientism for that matter? For an atheist to claim that God not existing was at least possible, I mean, of course I believe that it's possible for God to fail to exist. Of course I believe there is some possible world where atheism is true. This is not bold at all, seeing as how I also believe that such a possible world is the actual world. Lewis presses his objection to my premise in, though, with there really needs to be some support for the incredible claim that atheism is true in some possible world. I don't think it is possible that atheism is true, so you can't just throw out the statement, but in some possible world, atheism is true, because it doesn't match the logical facts we have. So I will take the high road on this one and concede to Lewis that I could give more argument for this premise. So I'll do that. I'll not only give more argument, but I'll then even take it a step further. So we can start off by saying that if conceivability implies possibility, or is at least a rough guide to what is possible, and I can consistently conceive or coherently imagine of a world where some particular concrete object fails to exist, then I'm justified in believing that it is at least possible for this particular concrete object to fail to exist. But this argument, I will concede, is not decisive on its own. But it is something, Ed, it is some reason to believe that atheism is a coherent supposition. But perhaps it is consistently conceivable or coherently imaginable that atheism is true, but these consistent conceivings and coherent imaginings do not have real or genuine possibilities as their objects. Perhaps there are inconsistencies or incoherencies which are not apparent, but we can still give further argument. It is a well-known principle of logic that claim that if the claim P, I missed another slide. Man, you guys, I really suck at this. So this is basically my argument from coherent conceivings and coherent imaginings. And so from here, if we're going to say that P, God exists, is true in every possible world, then any claim entailed by P would also be true in every possible world P entails. So it would also entail Q. It is not the case that the only persons are embodied persons. R, it is not the case that no one knows everything about the past. And S, it is not the case that no one can make a weight of more than 10,000 pounds rise into the air. Thus, if P is true in all possible worlds, then the negations of Q, R, and S would not be true in any possible world. But fairly obviously, the negations of these claims are possible. It is possible that Q star, the only persons are embodied persons. R star, no one knows everything about the past. And S star, no one can make a weight of more than 10 million pounds rise into the air. As before, the consistent conceivings and coherent imaginings of Q star, R star, and S star may not have real or genuine possibilities as their objects. But in the absence of any argument to the contrary, we ought to assume that atheism is at least a coherent supposition. This further argument for the possibility of atheism has been borrowed from the Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne's book, The Coherence of Theism. He also agrees with me that basic moral truths are necessary truths, and that atheism is true in some possible world. But if basic moral truths are true in all possible worlds, and God does not exist in all possible worlds because atheism is possibly true, then it follows that God cannot be the ground or foundation of basic moral truths. So that brings us to the end of Lewis's criticisms of my 5 arguments against his form of modified divine command theory, which he uses to defend a moral argument. But I wanted to give 2 further arguments that I've been working with. And so these are probably not as thought out as the other ones, in the sense that I have not dedicated as much time to these, or they are ones that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I've still been trying to come up with the strongest formulation or the clearest way of presenting it. And so this is just where I am today with these arguments. And so if these arguments change at all, I'll certainly release a future video highlighting how they have changed. But so far, what I've got, I will start with what I call the argument from other morally relevant considerations. So my premise A is that if modified divine command theory, or MDCT, is true, then there are no other morally relevant features other than God's commands that could give rise to genuine moral obligations. But then my premise B is, but there are morally relevant features of the world other than God's commands that could give rise to genuine moral obligations. Therefore, my conclusion in C is that modified divine command theory is false. So we can start off by saying, imagine that 1, I find some sentient creature that is in excruciating agony, and 2, I have the means to eliminate that agony at little to no cost to myself, and 3, I'm the only person around. I argue that these 3 non-moral facts are sufficient to give rise to a general moral obligation for me to eliminate this agony, even if that moral obligation cannot be reduced to these facts or identified with these facts. But divine command theory, or modified divine command theory, implies that these 3 non-moral facts are by themselves insufficient to give rise to a genuine moral obligation to eliminate such agony. In fact, modified divine command theory implies that these 3 facts are by themselves morally irrelevant. They are only morally relevant insofar as they consist as part of one of God's divine commands to me. MDCT implies there is one and only one feature of the world which could give rise to genuine moral obligations, and that is a command from God. But this implication is implausible. I also got this point from Eric Wielenberg's debate with Dr. Craig. I thought it was a strong point. Imagine if I claim that the only feature which could give rise to a genuine moral obligation is someone's prior making of a promise to perform some act. If this were the case, then I would only have a moral obligation to eliminate this sentient creature's agony if I had previously made a promise to this creature to always eliminate their agony so far as I could. The problem with this view is there are other features of the world which give rise to genuine moral obligations other than promise keeping. My promise keeping criterion of moral obligation cannot plausibly account for all the moral obligations within our moral experience. MDCT faces a similar problem. It identifies only one morally relevant feature of the world as the only feature which could give rise to a genuine moral obligation, and claims nothing else is morally relevant. So my objection here is that there are features of the world other than promise keeping and divine commands from God which give rise to genuine moral obligations, like my obligation to eliminate this child's agony. But if that's true, and modified divine command theory implies that God's commands are the only morally relevant features which could give rise to genuine moral obligations, then it follows that MDCT is false. So the last argument I want to look at, look at that, I missed more slides, is the argument from explanatory resources. Do I have a slide after? Let me check. I don't have a slide after this one. So this will be it. So this argument starts with premise A. If MDCT is true, then God's commands are a sufficient explanatory resource to explain all moral obligations. And then premise B, but God's commands do not have sufficient explanatory resources to explain all moral obligations. Therefore, C, modified divine command theory, is false. This argument is perhaps one of the easiest to defend because MDCT claims that all moral obligations are constituted by God's commands. In other words, God's commands are sufficient to explain why we have all the moral obligations that we do. Moral obligations are nothing but God's commands, and you don't need anything other than God's commands to have a moral obligation. But this is false. What would explain or ground our moral obligation to obey God's commands? Another command? If we accept this answer, then the question merely arises again. What would explain or ground our moral obligation to obey that command? It's obvious that no reply of this source could succeed. The only other plausible way out of this infinite regress problem is to admit that there are sui generis moral obligation to obey the commands of the divine commander. But that contradicts A and concedes my claim that basic moral truths, such as moral obligations, even those to obey God, are sui generis. The upshot of this is there is at least one moral obligation for which God's commands cannot explain or ground. Therefore, it would follow that MDCT is false. All right, guys, I know that this hasn't been my best video. It's my first one. I apologize to Lewis if the quality is not up to par yet. I'm still trying to get the hang of, making videos and doing response videos in constructive ways. So if you guys have any advice or comments or questions or anything, please be sure to leave them in the comments, like this video or share it. And if you haven't subscribed to our podcast or followed us on Facebook, I please recommend following our channel, Real Atheology, a Philosophy of Religion podcast. We're really excited about some of the stuff that we've got coming out. I just had finished up a debate with my friend Tyler Vela in Greensboro, North Carolina. They had the Mentionables conference. It was an apologetics conference. And the question under debate was, does the God of the Bible explain facts about suffering? Obviously, I argued in the negative. Tyler argued in the affirmative. So if you're interested in that kind of argument, I am very happy with my opening and my closing. I wouldn't change a single word about them. I was very happy with them. I stumbled a little bit in the Q&A by misspeaking a couple times. There's a couple times I was happy with the content of my answers in the Q&A, but I definitely, speaking on the fly is an area that I've got to improve on. So, but other than that, I was really happy with all the content. And if you're really interested in that, Tyler brought a presuppositional apologetics framework to answer in this question. So the debate is contrasted in that. You'll see my evidential approach and you'll see his presup approach. So we're obviously on different pages with methodology, but I think despite those differences, we still managed to put on a pretty good debate. So be sure to check that out. Hopefully I'll have that video up on YouTube as well. And if I can in time, I'll include it in the description to this video as well. So that's it for Real Atheology for today. I hope y'all have enjoyed this video, and I hope y'all find these arguments and these resources useful in your quests for truth. Take it easy, everyone.